Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Orangebloods Texas football YouTube channel. I'm Geoff Ketchum, joined by Anwar Richardson. Hit that like button if you like the video today, and subscribe if you'd like to see another one of these ever again in the future. It will help you, help us, it helps everybody, other than all of our enemies and who wants to help them. Do the organic, natural thing and subscribe to the page. Talking Texas football news of the day, if you will, Anwar. There's a little bit of transfer talk. There's a little bit of schedule talk, as literally 5 minutes ago, the school releases a press release just updating the TV partners and times for a couple of early Texas games. We now know that the Arkansas game, second week of the season, will be played 7 o'clock on national television on ESPN. It'll be a primetime nationally televised game on the big ESPN channel. Wouldn't be the ABC primetime game, but as far as exposure standpoints, it's really high. And then they just confirmed, I think, what we would have already have known. Although this game has ended up on Fox in the last couple of years, the Texas OU game, no time yet for that game, but it will be on the ESPN family of channels. So probably either ESPN or ABC. ESPN2, probably from a worst case scenario standpoint, should either of these teams or both come out of the chute stumbling. There's a chance that they could end up on that. Your first impressions from the scheduling news today. I think, again, the big thing is knowing the time of that Arkansas game, and suddenly those first two games, the Longhorns will have eyeballs in the opening couple of weeks of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's just something different about a nighttime game, Catch. It's a totally different feel. And so, they're going to go and play their first game, which is going to be, on the road. It's going to be a first for everybody, especially these new guys on the staff. It's going to be that first real true test potentially for whatever quarterback ends up winning this competition to go into a hostile environment, like as in Arkansas. And you've been kind of pounding the drum that don't let Arkansas's record from 2020 fool you. Going into that place, traditionally for Texas, it's been a tough place to play. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, of course, week one, Catch versus Louisiana. But then knowing that it's a night game, a lot of eyeballs that are going to be watching it. Is going to be, it's going to be a big game, obviously, for Arkansas to have Texas back in there. So you're going to probably expect that place is going to be jam-packed, shoulder to shoulder. Screw our masks. Hopefully no one has to worry about it by then. So it's a good test. It's a really good test because, the other part of playing a night game that's always really interesting for coaches is how do we occupy these players throughout the day, right? It's a little bit easier to do it, for a noon game. You wake up, go eat, maybe do a quick walkthrough, and then head over to the stadium. Now it's like sitting around, hanging around, watching other games. Like, how do you keep them all mentally focused for that? So it'll just be an interesting test within week two for the Steve Sarkisian era.
Hot take time, Anwar.
Uh-oh.
I figured out how to quantify why I think this Arkansas game will prove just to be trickier than it would look on paper when you say, well, they're just going to go play, a middling SEC team. Arkansas, you and I just finished an episode and it'll be out on our YouTube channel either same day as this one or probably the day after, day before. I'm not quite sure how we're going to release them. Be on the lookout for our A&M discussion. But we just had this conversation about this rivalry. So know this, Arkansas fans flat out hate Texas more than Texas A&M fans do.
Oh, wow.
I think if you understand that, so the level of emotion from their standpoint of and I don't think Texas feels the same way. This is historically a very Arkansas thing. I mean, Texas fans that in the old days would tell stories about not being sold gas when they drive. You better load up and fill your tank up when you leave Texarkana, the Texas side of it, because nobody will sell you gas on the kind of a strange thing to think about. And 2021, right? But that's the
Yeah.
level of spite that historically is involved in this game. And so, I think that it's something that the players won't, the players will feel it from the fans. And this all off season long, students and fans and whatever, when they talk to these kids, there are certain games that everybody talks about, right? So the Oklahoma game is probably a game this year that every Texas player gets asked about when this thing's getting ready to be played. I guarantee you the game that everybody in Arkansas is talking about throughout this offseason is that Texas game in week 2. There's just a level of importance and a level of focus that will be different for each of those two sides. They won't be able to feel the hatred, really and truly. But one side of that game will know for the 6 months leading up to it how much it means to one particular side. And I don't think it will quite be. We're not talking about Arkansas on the Texas side. We're doing a video only today because they announced the release of that game. This will be a game, though, that is circled on the Arkansas calendar in a way that it won't be for the Texas calendar. And that's my hesitation for that, is that I'm not saying I don't think Texas will win the game, because they're better than Arkansas, but they're not so much better that a night game on the road in a very hostile environment. And this could also be, I don't know what Arkansas's first game of the season is.
Right. I looked it up. They play Rice.
Where's that game at?
God, it's got to be, yes, it looks like it's home.
Okay. So only at worst the second game back from a pandemic, right? So like everybody's home games are going to be, I think, on fire this year in the beginning, as fans are just home field advantage. I think early in 2022 will be significant. I think it's an advantage that Texas will have. Texas had people in the stands. So it didn't affect college football as much as it affected some places. But I just think in general, as we come out of the pandemic, to some degree, I think the increase in the crowd, because you and I both think Texas will be at 100%.
Yes.
So
yes,
I have no doubts that Arkansas will probably be in the same boat, at which point, it'll have been a couple of years since Arkansas could fill up a stadium prime time, and they're doing it against their maybe most hated rivals. I mean, seriously, it's not a rivalry that's alive, but those people still hate Texas in a way that's not healthy. And I think it'll come alive in that game. And it makes that game really fun for me. As a guy that grew up when I was a kid watching Texas and Arkansas and knowing firsthand how bitter those games were. And once upon a time, when Arkansas left the Southwest Conference, it was not dissimilar to when Texas A&M left the Big 12. There was a lot of spite and it took a bowl game for these two teams to come back together and play again. And so there's a history there. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think when these two teams play, it's a lot of fun, mostly because of the hate that Arkansas brings to the table.
It's interesting. So their first 3 games are Rice at home, Texas at home, then Georgia Southern before they go and play Texas A&M. And so essentially, if you are Arkansas, and especially your coaching staff, you understand in your conference that they're not going to really compete for a conference championship. Now you'll tell yourself that, you'll tell your players that, and you'll come out and come out like your hair on fire. But we all understand what's going to happen at the end of the day. So this looks like that Texas game ends up being one of these constellation prizes that if you can get that notch on your belt, it'll make you feel good or about that season that you have if you finish with 6 wins, 7 wins, somewhere in that kind of frame, maybe 8 if all goes well. I mean, the rest of their schedule, I mean, they've got A&M, Georgia, Ole Miss, Auburn.
They've got their SEC West schedule.
Yeah. So they got Mississippi State, LSU, Alabama, Missouri. So I mean, they and then the SEC championship, which they won't be a part of. So I mean, And I watch Arkansas have like the most amazing season ever, and then someone throws this video in our face. But more likely, so this
I can live with that.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be fine. But it just ends up being something that it's big for them. Like, this is a huge, like, this is, when you look at like Louisiana, that opening game is going to be huge. You could talk about, well, there's a disciple of Nick Saban with Texas. Well, so they got one on that side too, who's got as much to prove and want to get to probably a major program as well. And this becomes his audition. So, I think the first 2 games for Texas, Catch, and we should probably just keep this as one video and then we'll do some other stuff. I think the first 2 games for Texas, it's a very tricky start to a new era, because even Louisiana, they're good. Like, this is a 10-win team every year. So the last 2 years, so they've been pretty good, and they've got a lot of guys returning. So they've got a very good team that's going to be coming into DKR. And then you start looking at, to your point, Arkansas, that's a road game. There's just a lot of things that happen and tricky. And like, Texas at this point, Catch, is not at the point where they can just roll the ball out and you just know that they're going to do what they do. That's just not Texas at this moment. Like, there haven't been many games. Kids, go back over how many years we talked about it in one of the videos. I mean, Kansas State happened last year and Colorado happened last year, but we haven't seen Texas just do what they do in non-conference games. In fact, there's always been a struggle within non-conference games over, a decade or so or more, whether it has been a loss to an LSU, whether it's been Notre Dame, whether it's been a USC, whether it's been BYU, right? All these times you'd say, oh man, you should go ahead and that's an easy win. And these non-conference games have been tricky, for Texas. So this is not a program that you can just walk in and say, yes, Arkansas was trash last year. Look at what Texas is going to do. They're going to run up the score. This is one of those like, hey, all right, until you are the man that can do that, you got to know, like, hey, this is going to be a potentially close battle.
I think the last thing I'll say on this, so that we don't overcook the Arkansas grits too much. But thank you to the SID people at Texas for giving us like a fresh thing, a newsy thing to talk about on what would otherwise be a somewhat slow Tuesday in May. The way this thing shakes out from a build-up standpoint is fascinating to me. When you look at the Texas side of things, I saw this Stuart Mandel tweet from earlier this morning, from what, and it says, there are no kickoff times for this, but it's talking about the games on the opening weekend of the college football season. You've got Clemson and Georgia, Alabama, Miami, LSU, UCLA, Penn State, Wisconsin, Indiana, Iowa, Texas against Louisiana, San Jose State against USC, Boise State against Central Florida. And then on Sunday, you've got Florida State and Notre Dame. Wow. So on that weekend, you have at least a half dozen games involving ranked teams, and Texas gets to be a part of that. I mean, look, there will be no illusions in the minds of Texas fans or Texas players from its coaching staff this year that the opening game is a layup. It will be sold as, this is a ranked team. This is a dangerous team. The nation will be watching. Win this game, open eyeballs, we're on our way. So then the Arkansas game follows that, and it'll be a win or lose. The goal, we can talk about this months in advance. It's obvious. This is obvious. This is A plus B equals C stuff. No matter win or lose following a game against a ranked team, no matter who they would play, the challenge is regroup immediately. We've got a road game against a historically arch rival the next week. Our level of focus and readiness has to be extremely high going into both games. So much so that you have to hold, you don't want there to be a hangover. Again, win or lose. This is a program that when it wins a game against a ranked team early in the season, starts to get the headlines, starts to feel real good about itself, and often makes itself vulnerable. Whereas if you were to lose that game, then it's can't let one loss turn into two losses. You can't feel so down about losing that game that you start out 0-2 because you don't pick yourself up. So it'll take a real mature performance from the Texas side of things, I think, to navigate those first two games for those reasons that I've outlined. Arkansas' schedule is really different. The opening weekend of the season, they play a game against Rice that nobody will watch. Nobody will care. The game after Texas, they're playing Georgia Southern. So what they've given themselves is a tune-up for Texas, really and truly. That's how they will view. Texas can't hold anything back against Louisiana for Arkansas. Arkansas, in theory, could hold some wrinkles back, save a few things, and know that when they're done with Texas, I mean, their coaches can talk about Georgia Southern being a trap game, but it's not a dangerous trap game against a team that on paper matches you in personnel, even remotely so. So Arkansas has tune-up game, big game, take a break game. I mean, really, that's what that is, because they have A&M the weekend after that. So what they're essentially doing is Texas will be their everything in the non-conference. And once they're done with that, they'll have 2 weeks to prepare for the next ramp up. And that includes a patsy that, barring a historically horrific result, would mean that, you know, they start out 2-1 at worst, because you feel like they'll beat Rice and they'll beat Georgia Southern. They'll circle Texas in a way now that's just different than the way Texas will schedule Arkansas. And I think it is one of the things about this game that we can talk about now, that when we get there, you won't feel it. But this game's 5 months out, 4 months out, and you can still sense how the lead up will look. And it's not the same for either side. And it's what makes the Texas game, the Arkansas game, a trap game for Texas. Arkansas will just be able, they'll have an advantage in being able to prepare. Texas will have an advantage in that they'll have played the first truly highly competitive game. Like if iron sharpens iron, then Texas comes into Arkansas more ready for that game based on the level of competition from week one. But Arkansas, from a mentality standpoint, gets to place in a primetime game at home a level of focus on what they can prepare for Texas in August if they want to. Texas won't really start preparing for Arkansas until the week of. And I think that whole mentality for both sides potentially creates, if Arkansas were to win that game, we will then look back on it and say, wow, all of these things that we've talked about really played out as reasons why something happens. If it ends up being a really tough game and Texas struggles to win, it's a highly competitive game, we'll look back and go, that's why it was more competitive than maybe we would have thought coming in. And if Texas just kicks their ass, and all this stuff was a waste of breath. I tend to think it'll be somewhere in the middle. And that's why it's worthy conversation here on a Tuesday on the Orangebloods YouTube channel. Real quick, because I don't know that we need to talk about this a lot. But let's talk about the transfer thing real quick so we don't have to do a second video. The quarterback kid out of LSU, TJ Finley.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot there. Like, there's no reason to even do, I think, a separate video to hype up a kid that at this point, it doesn't feel like Texas is seriously involved in. But it does bring up the conversation of that we've talked about a little bit, a quarterback transfer, and how if Texas had 5 scholarships open, I'm of the opinion it wouldn't be a terrible idea to just go get somebody that started some games in his career. You know, there's a kid at Chris Robinson that played at Oklahoma once upon a time. He was a starter last year for Florida Atlantic. He does not have guys knocking down his door. But in a worst case scenario, your third string quarterback having some major college football experience, to me, sounds like a great backup plan to have. Most of these guys in the portal do not want to be third string guys.
Correct.
But in a world where you can find a guy like that, it's funny because people are like, you can't go get TJ Finley because it might upset the apple cart with Casey Thompson and Hudson Card. I kind of agree with that. You wouldn't want to bring a third guy in that's viewed as a threat to both of them. It's not a great vote of confidence for either. And yet I still find myself saying, from an insurance standpoint, if you could get a guy that ensures that Charles Wright is never your backup quarterback as a true freshman next season, you need to do that. Give me your thoughts on all of that, just from a philosophical standpoint.
I think philosophically, it makes all the sense in the world, right? To your point, the application of it is just the difficult part. Like, I 100% agree. Like, you want to be able to have someone that we're going to anticipate attrition for, in that room. We have if Casey Thompson loses the job, we know he's out. Okay. And we know he's gone. And so then it's a Hudson Card, Charles Wright thing. Like, you just don't want to have two quarterbacks. And we're making the assumption right now that Hudson Card would stay. We don't know that for gospel truth, because we know these guys, or they get there like, all right, listen, man, like Casey, that means Casey's got this job for another 2 years, but he's got 3 years of eligibility. We don't know. Hudson may look at that and say, man, who knows what might happen. So
he can feel different in 2 months about it than he does. Both of them could. Like,
absolutely.
To me, this is about you're being a good Boy Scout. You're always prepared. Now, the application of it that was the perfect word for it, because it's much trickier. And they don't have 5 scholarships available. Then it is, do we want an insurance policy that we don't even know that we need over somebody who might, in theory, be able to come out and help us at a need position? It is risk versus reward. There's some, they've got to quantify how urgent needs are in different areas and how to allocate that one need. But when TJ Finley's name was mentioned, the quarterback part didn't surprise me, that it would have been him, and his profile reads like a guy that wants to be in competition for starting now. And he's not better than Casey Thompson or Hudson Card. So that part of it didn't make sense. But if we were to get to June and some kid, I don't know, the former starting quarterback at Sam Houston State, I just invented a guy. Like, I don't know who that is, but somebody that has played at a decent level, started a lot of games, and would be okay. Maybe he's got like 2 years of eligibility left, and he'd just be okay with being on playing for Texas. And he's legit enough that he won't trip over his own feet. Like, I wouldn't be shocked. I wouldn't, because it would, to me, it would be very smart. I would never, in a philosophical view, I never would want to come into a season where my third guy is a true freshman, just in case. I mean, then you're one step away from potentially your entire season falling apart. And if there's ever anything you can do to ensure that in a worst case situation, you don't feel like your team will fall apart, then I think, you probably need to do that. I'm kind of team getting a quarterback before the season starts. It probably doesn't happen, but I would be terrified of the worst case occurring. And I don't know how you even remotely allow yourself to let the worst case be up. So if you had a guy that was coming in, it was like, oh, he's not going to compete, but he gives you some depth, then the worst case isn't that worst anymore. Then it's like, okay, now Sark can make a decision without feeling like he's compromising himself in a way that doesn't allow him to just make the decision for what's best now. I don't know. I don't think it'll happen, but TJ Finley as a concept didn't make me flinch. Just his profile did, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'll just say like this, and last thing I'll say on it is there's a quarterback out there who would say, you know what, I wouldn't mind getting a graduate degree from the University of Texas, hanging out in Austin for a couple of years and enjoying the good life. There's somebody, to your point, who's played at a Sam Houston State or another smaller program where it's like, you know what, I know I'm never going pro.
Yes.
But wouldn't mind just chilling in Austin for a couple of years. I got a decent arm, I can be a capable body, to fill in, to make sure, because to your point, the Charles Wright thing, he's developmental. Like it's all about developing him and getting him to a point where he could be serviceable. And that's in a few years. If God forbid, someone stubs a toe and then you got to throw someone in there who's that young, the potential of screwing them up, by not having that early success definitely is not to his benefit at all. So I'm with you on that for the theoretical standpoint. Hard to apply it, but I'm with you.
For Anwar Richardson and myself, Geoff Ketchum, hit the like, hit the subscribe button. Until next time, later.